Some people leave without ever walking away. There's a specific kind of ending that doesn't announce itself. No door slams, no final conversation. Just a slow, nearly invisible withdrawal that reshapes the entire emotional architecture of a relationship before anyone's willing to name it. This isn't about dramatic exits or sudden betrayals. It's about the quiet recalibration that happens when one person begins to detach, and the other doesn't realize it until the distance has already become structural. Relationship psychology operates beneath the surface of conscious awareness most of the time. Behavioral patterns form in silence. Emotional behavior shifts without permission. And by the time the change is visible, it's already been happening for months. What we're examining here isn't a single event. It's a sequence. A progression of psychological dynamics that begin with something almost imperceptible. A lightness. A slight reduction in urgency. A delay that feels situational. And end with a gap too wide to ignore. Attachment patterns don't dissolve overnight. They erode, slowly, through repeated micro-withdrawals that accumulate into something undeniable. This is the part most people miss. They're looking for the moment it ended. But relationship patterns don't work that way. They work through repetition. Through the slow, consistent withdrawal of presence, effort, reciprocity. Through the quiet decision to stop choosing someone, made not once, but over and over, in 100 small, unremarkable moments. The focus here isn't on the person who left. It's on the architecture of how leaving happens when no one's actually leaving. On how emotional distance becomes familiar. On how one person can still be physically present while being emotionally absent. On the way behavior analysis reveals truth long before words ever do. Because actions don't lie. Silence doesn't lie. Patterns don't lie. When someone stops showing up, not dramatically, just consistently, they're already communicating everything that needs to be said. The only question is whether the other person is ready to hear it. This is an investigation into that shift, not to explain it away, not to offer solutions, just to map it, to trace the outline of how emotional withdrawal moves through a relationship, stage by stage, until the reality of what's happened becomes impossible to overlook. If you've felt the distance but couldn't name it, if you've questioned your perception because nothing felt definitively wrong, if you've wondered when things changed and why you didn't see it sooner, this is that map. This is the pattern, laid bare. Something lifts, not dramatically, not with clarity. Just a faint reduction in weight that doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the breath, in the pace of thoughts, in the way silence stops feeling heavy. There's no single moment to point to. No decision that marks it. Just a shift in how the body holds tension, how the mind moves through the day. It doesn't feel like progress. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like nothing, which is precisely why it goes unnoticed. The emotional system recalibrates in the background, adjusting to a new baseline that hasn't yet been named. This lightness doesn't demand attention. It exists in the margins of awareness, easy to attribute to external factors. A better night's sleep, a distraction at work, a temporary reprieve from something unrelated. The mind reaches for explanations that feel safer than the truth. Because naming it would require acknowledging what came before it. And acknowledging what came before, it would mean confronting the weight that was carried without permission, without protest, without end. So the lightness floats, unanchored, unexamined. Behavioral patterns begin shifting beneath conscious recognition. responding to something the person hasn't yet allowed themselves to see. There's a quiet in the chest that wasn't there before. Not peace, not emptiness. Something closer to suspension. The emotional body isn't reacting the way it used to. Small triggers that once pulled focus now pass through without catching. The internal dialogue softens, not because problems have been solved, but because the system has quietly begun withdrawing energy from a source it no longer believes will respond. This is where psychological dynamics start rearranging themselves in silence. The architecture of attention changes. What once commanded emotional priority begins to fade into peripheral awareness, unremarked and unmourned in the moment. It's too early to call it detachment. It's too subtle to feel like a shift. But something inside has already decided. The body knows before the mind does. Relationship psychology doesn't always move through conscious thought. It moves through the nervous system first, through the quiet recalibration of what feels safe, what feels sustainable, what feels worth holding on to. And in this early stage, the lightness is just that, early, unprocessed, floating in the space between what was and what will eventually become undeniable. The pattern is forming, but the observer hasn't turned to look at it yet. The conversations don't stop. They just lose a certain charge. Messages still arrive, responses still follow, but the rhythm has changed in a way that's hard to name. There's less immediacy, less of that pull to reply quickly, to check in without prompting, to fill silence before it stretches too long. It doesn't register as withdrawal because the structure is still intact. The appearance of connection remains, but beneath it, something has slowed. The emotional behavior that once fueled spontaneity has quieted, replaced by something more measured, more deliberate, more controlled. It feels situational because situational is easier to accept than systemic. Excuses come naturally. They're busy. Work is demanding. Life has gotten heavier. These explanations hold just enough truth to be believable, just enough weight to stop further inquiry. And maybe they are true. But they're also incomplete, because busyness doesn't erase urgency when urgency is real. Stress doesn't silence someone who still feels tethered. The mind accepts the surface reason because the alternative, that the urgency has simply dissolved, requires looking at something far less comfortable. Attachment patterns don't broadcast themselves. They shift quietly, in the space between what's said and what's done, between intention and follow-through. There's a flatness now in exchanges that used to carry texture. Questions get answered, but not expanded. Plans get acknowledged, but not initiated. The energy required to maintain momentum has become unevenly distributed, though this imbalance hasn't been named aloud. One person is still leaning in. The other is leaning back, not dramatically, not with cruelty, just with a quiet, almost imperceptible withdrawal of emotional resources. Relationship dynamics begin to reveal themselves not in what's present, but in what's subtly absent. The emotional distance grows not through conflict, but through the slow erosion of reciprocal effort. It's easy to rationalize, to think it's temporary, to believe things will return to normal once the external pressure lifts. But the early indicators of a shift rarely reverse on their own. Behavior analysis reveals that when emotional investment begins to contract, it does so in response to something deeper than circumstance. The system is protecting itself, recalibrating, pulling back energy that no longer feels returned. And in these early stages, The one still engaged often doesn't realize they're the only one still holding the line. The quiet has settled in, and with it, the first outline of a pattern that will only become clearer with time. It starts with minutes, then hours, then a day passes and the message sits, marked as read but unanswered. There's no hostility in the delay, no anger, just a lag that wasn't there before. Responses arrive eventually, polite and functional, but stripped of the warmth that used to carry them. The words are fine, the tone is fine, but something underneath has shifted. The speed at which someone shows up reveals how much space they're holding for you in their attention. And when that speed drops without explanation, the emotional behavior beneath it is already speaking. These delays become habitual, not because of malice, but because they reflect a quiet redrawing of priority. What once felt urgent no longer does. The internal alarm that used to go off when someone was left waiting has been turned down, maybe even turned off. It's not that they don't care. It's that the caring has become less automatic, less instinctive, less central to their emotional rhythm. Psychological dynamics shift this way, not through dramatic exits, but through small, repeated withdrawals that accumulate over time. Each delay is minor. Each softened reply is understandable. But together, they form a language. The person on the receiving end starts to notice, though they may not yet trust what they're noticing. They tell themselves it's nothing, that they're overthinking, that everyone gets busy. And maybe that's true. But behavior doesn't lie the way words do. Behavior is the truest language in relationship psychology. It shows investment, presence, priority. And when behavior begins to consistently demonstrate distance, no amount of verbal reassurance can rewrite what the pattern is already saying. The attachment that once felt secure begins to feel conditional, fragile, maintained more by memory than by current action. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes with being the one who's still engaged, while the other has quietly begun to withdraw. It's not rejection. It's not abandonment. It's something quieter and harder to name. A slow fade, a gentle pulling back. And because it happens gradually, because there's no clear breaking point, it becomes easy to doubt your own perception, to wonder if you're inventing the distance, to question whether the shift is real or imagined. But relationship patterns don't need to be loud to be true. They just need to repeat. And once repetition sets in, the outline of what's happening starts to emerge from the background. There are moments when the distance feels almost comfortable, when not hearing from them brings a strange kind of ease, a reduction in the low-grade tension that had been building without notice. It's confusing, because part of you still wants the connection, still checks for their name, still hopes for the message. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, feels lighter in their absence. This duality doesn't make sense at first. How can you miss someone and feel relieved they're not there? How can you want closeness and also feel steadied by space? The emotional body is processing something the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. This fluctuation is a signal, not of ambivalence, but of misalignment. When someone's presence starts to feel heavier than their absence, the relationship dynamics have already shifted beneath the surface. The relief isn't about not caring. It's about not carrying. About the temporary suspension of a weight that's been held for too long without acknowledgement, without reciprocity, without rest. The unease comes from knowing that relief shouldn't feel this way. That wanting space from someone you're supposed to want close means something's broken in the structure. But naming it requires confronting what's been quietly true for longer than you've been willing to admit. Attachment patterns reveal themselves in these contradictions. The part that still reaches is operating from history, from the version of the relationship that used to feel stable. The part that pulls back is operating from present reality, from the accumulated evidence of withdrawal, delay, and softened presence. One is still hoping, the other is already protecting, and the space between them is where the internal conflict lives. Emotional behavior doesn't always move in clean lines. Sometimes it moves in waves, advancing and retreating, trying to find equilibrium in a system that's no longer balanced. The mind tries to explain it away, attributes the unease to stress, to overthinking, to personal insecurity, and maybe those things are present, but they're not the source. The source is the slow erosion of something that once felt secure and no longer does. The relief is the body's quiet acknowledgement that it's been working too hard to sustain something that stopped being mutual. And the unease is the heart's resistance to letting go of what it still remembers as safe. Neither feeling is wrong. Both are true. And together they mark the beginning of a reckoning that hasn't yet been named aloud, but is already underway in the silence. One person is still initiating, still planning, still checking in. The other is responding, but not reciprocating. There's a difference, a crucial one. Responding means showing up when called. Reciprocating means calling back. And when that balance tips, when one person consistently carries the momentum while the other simply allows themselves to be carried, the relationship psychology shifts into something unsustainable. It doesn't feel like imbalance at first. It feels like a phase. Like something that will self-correct once the other person has more bandwidth, more energy, more emotional availability. But phases don't last months. Patterns do. The one still engaged begins to adjust. Not consciously, not with resentment, just with a quiet recalibration of how much they'll offer before expecting something in return. They stop reaching out as often, not to punish, but to test, to see if the other person will notice the absence, to see if the silence will prompt action. And when it doesn't, when the silence is met with more silence, the message is clear. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always announce itself, it just stops showing up. And the space it leaves behind either gets filled by the other person, or it stays empty, growing wider with each passing day. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the only one still trying. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being in something that no longer feels mutual. Of holding space for someone who's stopped holding space back. Behavioral patterns in relationship dynamics reveal this repeatedly. When effort becomes one-sided, attachment begins to erode. Not because love disappears, but because connection requires more than love. It requires presence. It requires reciprocity. It requires both people choosing actively and consistently to show up. And when one person stops choosing, the other is left holding the entire weight alone. The rationalizations continue. They're going through something. They'll come back around. This is just how they are under pressure. And maybe all of that is true. But truth doesn't make a pattern sustainable. It doesn't make the imbalance any less exhausting. Emotional behavior under stress reveals priority. When someone is stretched thin, they don't disappear from everything. They disappear from what matters less. And when someone begins to disappear from you, when their effort fades while yours remains, the relationship is already in a state of quiet collapse. The structure is still standing, but the foundation has started to crack. Space feels intentional. It feels like breathing room. Like a mutual agreement to step back, recharge, and return. A shift, on the other hand, feels like something breaking quietly in the background. The difference between the two isn't always obvious in the moment. Space closes. A shift doesn't. Space is chosen by both people, even if unspoken. A shift is one person pulling back while the other is still leaning in. And when distance is misread as space, when withdrawal is mistaken for self-care, the emotional distance grows unchecked because it's never been correctly identified. The person still engaged convinces themselves that giving room is the right move, that pushing would only create pressure, that waiting is the mature response. And in some cases, that's true. But waiting only works when the other person is coming back. When someone is genuinely overwhelmed and needs time, they communicate that. They offer reassurance. They check in, even briefly, to signal that the connection still matters. When that doesn't happen, when silence stretches without explanation and distance becomes the default rather than the exception, it's no longer space. It's avoidance. And avoidance, when it becomes consistent, is a form of emotional withdrawal that rarely reverses on its own. Relationship patterns built on misread signals don't survive long-term. Because one person is operating under the assumption that things are temporary, while the other has already started adjusting to a new emotional baseline. One is waiting for reconnection. The other has quietly accepted disconnection. This misalignment doesn't resolve through patience alone. It resolves through confrontation, through honest naming of what's happening, through both people deciding whether they want to close the gap or let it widen. But confrontation requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. And trust, at this point, has already started to erode. There's a moment in every slow fade where distance stops being situational and starts being structural. Where it's no longer about what someone is going through, but about how they've chosen to go through it, with you or without you. Psychological dynamics reveal that when someone stops including you in their process, when they stop reaching out during difficulty rather than toward you, the attachment has already loosened. They've begun to emotionally self-soothe in your absence rather than in your presence. And that shift, once it takes root, is far harder to reverse than most people realize. The distance has stopped being space. It's become the new shape of the relationship. It's no longer occasional. It's no longer situational. The delays, the softness, the lack of reciprocity, they've formed a baseline. What was once an exception has become the rule. There's a predictability now to how little they show up, how slowly they respond, how much effort is required to maintain even basic connection. And predictability, in relationship psychology, is data. It's not a bad day. It's not a rough week. It's a pattern. And patterns don't lie. They reveal priority, investment, and where someone has quietly decided to place their emotional energy. When that energy is consistently elsewhere, the message is already clear. The person still engaged begins to feel it in their body before they fully understand it in their mind. There's a heaviness when thinking about reaching out. A hesitation that wasn't there before. A quiet dread around initiating conversation because the response feels more like obligation than desire. Emotional behavior shifts in response to repeated withdrawal. The one who's been trying starts to protect themselves, often without realizing it. They pull back slightly, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. They stop offering as much, stop asking as much, stop expecting as much. And in that contraction, the relationship begins its slow, silent collapse. Behavioral patterns become undeniable at this stage. The other person's absence isn't random, it's structured. Their presence, when it does appear, feels performative rather than organic. They show up just enough to keep the connection from fully breaking, but not enough to sustain it with any real vitality. This is where attachment patterns reveal their architecture. Avoidant behavior doesn't always look cold. Sometimes it looks calm, detached but polite, present but unreachable. And the person on the receiving end is left in a strange limbo, unsure whether to hold on or let go, because neither option feels clear or clean. The pattern doesn't need to be discussed to be felt. It's in every delayed response, every plan that never materializes, every conversation that ends before it deepens. Relationship dynamics at this stage are defined not by what's happening, but by what's stopped happening. The emotional investment that once felt mutual now feels one-sided. The connection that once felt easy now feels labored. And the person who's still trying is forced to confront a truth they've been avoiding. The other person has already left. Not physically, not officially, but emotionally, they've been withdrawing for a while. And no amount of effort from one side can pull someone back who's already decided to step away. At some point, the absence stops hurting the way it used to. Not because it doesn't matter, but because the system has adjusted. The emotional body has recalibrated around the distance, learned to function within it, stopped fighting against it. There's a quiet resignation that settles in. Not dramatic, not announced, just a subtle acceptance that this is how things are now. The disruption that once came with their silence has faded. Not because the silence has changed, but because it's become expected. Psychological dynamics shift this way, through adaptation, through the slow normalization of what was once unbearable. This is where emotional withdrawal completes its work. When distance stops feeling like distance and starts feeling like baseline, the relationship has fundamentally changed. The person who was once central becomes peripheral. Their presence, when it appears, no longer brings relief. It brings mild surprise. Their absence no longer triggers panic or longing. It just registers as another day in a long string of similar days. The attachment that once felt urgent has loosened, not through active decision, but through the passive erosion of repeated neglect. The bond doesn't snap, it frays. And by the time it's fully frayed, both people have already moved into separate emotional territories. There's a strange kind of peace in this stage. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of surrender. The one who was trying has stopped trying as hard. They've pulled their energy back, redirected it elsewhere, stopped waiting for the other person to show up in the way they once did. This isn't detachment by choice. It's detachment by necessity. The emotional system can only sustain one-sided effort for so long before it begins to protect itself by withdrawing investment. Relationship psychology reveals this repeatedly. When someone stops showing up, eventually you stop saving them a seat. The distance is no longer painful because it's no longer surprising. It's just the shape of things now. The relationship exists in name, maybe even an occasional interaction, but the emotional core has hollowed out. Behavioral patterns have fully solidified. Both people have adjusted to a version of connection that requires almost nothing from either of them. And in that low-demand state, the relationship can limp forward indefinitely, maintained by inertia rather than intention. But it's no longer alive in any real sense. It's just familiar. And familiarity, without presence, is one of the quietest forms of loss. There's no fight, no accusation, no moment where everything breaks apart. Just a slow, almost invisible reduction in the small acts that once held the relationship together. The gestures that used to happen without thought, checking in, asking how someone's day went, noticing when they're off, offering support before it's requested, they stop. Not all at once. Not with any clear turning point. Just a quiet withdrawal of the instinctive care that once flowed naturally between two people. Emotional behavior doesn't always end in confrontation. Sometimes it just fades, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Reciprocity is the structural integrity of connection. When both people give and receive in rhythm, the relationship sustains itself. But when one person stops offering without the other adjusting in response, the imbalance becomes permanent. And that's what's happening here. The gestures are no longer mutual. One person has stopped reaching. The other, worn down by the lack of return, has started to pull back as well. Not out of spite, not out of anger, just out of exhaustion. Relationship dynamics can't survive on memory alone. They need active, ongoing investment. And when that investment drops below a certain threshold, the relationship enters a quiet state of emotional collapse. There's a specific loneliness in this stage. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being with someone who's stopped seeing you, who's stopped showing up emotionally even when they're physically present. The small acts of connection that used to affirm the bond, texting something that reminded them of you, making plans without prompting, noticing when you're quiet and asking why, they've disappeared. And without them, the relationship becomes transactional, functional at best, empty at worst. Attachment patterns reveal that when emotional gestures stop flowing, the bond itself begins to dissolve. The absence of conflict makes it harder to name. If there were fights, there would be something to point to. Something concrete. Something that could be addressed or resolved. But this isn't loud. It's silent. It's the slow erosion of care, of presence, of the small daily choices that keep two people emotionally tethered. Psychological dynamics teach that this kind of ending is often the most difficult to process, because there's no clear villain, no identifiable moment of betrayal. Just two people who stopped choosing each other in the quiet, unremarkable moments that actually matter. And by the time it's visible, the gap is already too wide to close without both people actively deciding to rebuild. Most don't. They just let the distance stay. Eventually, the truth stops hiding. What was once subtle, once deniable, once easy to rationalize away, becomes undeniable. The emotional shift that began as a faint lightness, as a barely perceptible change in rhythm, has fully materialized into something that can no longer be ignored. The distance is real. The withdrawal is complete. The connection that once felt secure now feels like a memory of something that used to exist but doesn't anymore. Relationship psychology reveals that this moment doesn't arrive suddenly. It's been building the entire time. But it's only now, after months of small patterns stacking into an undeniable structure, that the full reality becomes visible. There's a clarity that comes with this recognition, though it's not the kind anyone asks for. It's the clarity of finally seeing what's been true all along. That the other person left a long time ago. That the relationship ended not in a single moment, but across hundreds of small moments where they chose distance instead of closeness, silence instead of presence, withdrawal instead of engagement. Behavioral patterns don't need words to communicate. They communicate through absence, through the consistent failure to show up, through the quiet refusal to meet someone halfway. And when those patterns become undeniable, the person left holding space is forced to reckon with a truth they've been resisting. They've been alone in this for longer than they knew. This is where emotional behavior and psychological dynamics converge into a single, unavoidable reality. The attachment is broken, not because of a fight, not because of betrayal, but because one person detached and the other kept trying to hold something that was no longer being held from the other side. The shift is complete. The emotional distance that was once a gap has become a canyon, and no amount of effort from one person can build a bridge across it when the other person has stopped building on their end. Relationship patterns teach this over and over. When one person decides the connection no longer serves them, the connection ends, whether or not it's been officially named. There's nothing left to misread, no more space to give, no more patience to extend. The emotional shift after detachment isn't about the other person anymore. It's about the person who stayed, who tried, who held on longer than they should have. It's about recognizing that the relationship they were fighting for doesn't exist anymore. That the person they were reaching for has already moved on emotionally, even if they haven't said it aloud. And in that recognition, there's grief. But there's also release. Because the worst part wasn't the distance. It was the uncertainty. And now, finally, there is none. The shift doesn't reverse itself. It doesn't heal through silence or patience, or hoping the other person will suddenly remember who you used to be to them. Emotional withdrawal, once it's become a pattern, rarely moves backward on its own. What you've seen here isn't a phase someone passes through. It's a map of how detachment completes itself when it's left unaddressed. And the clarity, as uncomfortable as it is also the exit. Because you can't fix what the other person has already decided to leave behind. You can only stop pretending the connection still exists in the form you're trying to preserve. This kind of ending doesn't come with closure. It comes with recognition. With the slow, painful understanding that someone can be in your life and still be gone. That presence without emotional investment is just proximity. That waiting for someone to choose you again when they've already stopped choosing is not loyalty. It's erosion. Relationship psychology doesn't reward hope when behavior has already spoken. It rewards the willingness to see what's true, even when what's true dismantles everything you were holding on to. If you stayed with this investigation all the way through, it's because some part of you already knew. You've been watching the pattern. You've been feeling the distance. You've been carrying the weight of a connection that stopped being mutual a long time ago. And now you have the language for it. Now you can stop questioning your perception and start trusting what the behavior has been telling you from the beginning. That's not the ending you wanted. But it's the one that lets you stop waiting for someone who's already left. There's something else you need to see. Because this shift, the one you just traced, it didn't start here. It started earlier. In the moment when answers stopped coming. When the silence became permanent, and you were left holding questions that were never going to be addressed. That's where the detachment took root. If you haven't watched What Remained When Explanations Never Arrived, you need to. That video maps the beginning of this pattern. The moment the other person decided you weren't owed clarity. The moment emotional withdrawal became their chosen language. This investigation makes sense only if you understand what came before it. So go back, watch it, and then you'll see the full picture of how someone can disappear without ever leaving the room. If this resonated, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because we're not done mapping the psychology of how relationships end in silence. There's more to uncover. And you'll want to be here when we do.